On an October night in 1970, Sacramento was wrapped in the golden warmth of an Indian summer, but darkness lurked behind every autumn leaf. Sarah Elizabeth Crawford, a 28-year-old court reporter with dreams as bright as her engagement ring, stepped out of the Sacramento County Courthouse with her familiar leather briefcase and a smile that had been lighting up courtrooms for 5 years. She drove to her modest apartment on Riverside Drive, a cozy sanctuary where her wedding dress hung pristine and untouched, just 3 weeks away from the most important day of her life. The next morning, when her fiancé knocked on her door with coffee and donuts, silence would greet him instead of her laughter. What happened in the darkness of that autumn night would carve a wound in Sacramento's heart that would bleed for 52 years, leaving a community haunted by an unanswered question that would outlive an entire generation. Before diving into this story of love interrupted and justice delayed, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated with the latest cold case mysteries that refuse to stay buried. On the evening of October 15, 1970, Sarah Elizabeth Crawford, a 28-year-old court reporter at the Sacramento County Superior Court, finished transcribing testimony from a particularly complex fraud case. She was meticulous in her work, a trait that made her beloved by judges and attorneys who knew they could count on her precision. That night, Sarah wore a cream-colored blouse, her favorite burgundy skirt, and carried the worn leather briefcase her father had given her when she started her career. The briefcase that held not just transcripts and stenography equipment, but wedding planning notes tucked between legal documents. As she left the courthouse, Sarah waved goodbye to the security guard, Mr. Henderson, who had worked the evening shift for 15 years. "See you Monday, Miss Crawford," he called out, watching her walk toward her car with that familiar bounce in her step, a bounce that would be remembered by those who knew her as the embodiment of joy itself. For Sarah was just 21 days away from marrying David Mitchell, her college sweetheart, who had proposed on the steps of the state capitol 6 months earlier. Sarah drove her powder-blue Volkswagen Beetle through the quiet residential streets toward her apartment on Riverside Drive, humming along to the radio playing Close to You by the Carpenters. The song that would become, in the cruel twist of fate, forever associated with her memory. Her small one-bedroom apartment was her sanctuary, decorated with houseplants, law books and wedding magazines spread across the coffee table like fallen hopes. That night, Sacramento was as it always was in mid-October. Street lamps cast pools of amber light on sidewalks littered with fallen leaves. The scent of wood smoke from fireplaces drifted through the evening air, and no one walking the peaceful streets could have imagined that in one of those quiet apartments a nightmare was about to unfold. The next morning, Saturday, October 16th, when David Mitchell climbed the stairs to Sarah's apartment with their weekend ritual of coffee and fresh donuts from Romano's Bakery, he expected to hear her typewriter clicking away as she worked on freelance transcription to save money for their honeymoon. Instead, he found her door slightly ajar, which sent the first chill of dread down his spine. Sarah was obsessive about locking her door, a habit born from years of working in criminal court and hearing testimonies that made her cautious about home security. "Sarah?" David called, pushing the door open wider. "Honey, are you all right?" The silence that greeted him was not the comfortable quiet of morning sleep, but something heavier, more ominous. As he stepped inside, the coffee cup slipped from his trembling hand, crashing to the floor in the explosion of ceramic and dark liquid that would forever mark the moment innocence died in Sacramento. What David discovered in that apartment would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sarah lay in her living room, her cream blouse torn and stained with blood, her engagement ring still catching the morning light streaming through the window. The brutality of the scene was matched only by its randomness. Nothing appeared to be stolen, no signs of forced entry, no indication that Sarah knew her attacker. David's screams brought neighbors running. Mrs. Rodriguez from downstairs, who had heard nothing during the night, found David kneeling beside Sarah's body, his hands shaking as he tried to dial the rotary phone. The Sacramento Police Department received the call at 9:47 a.m., and within minutes, the quiet residential street was transformed into a crime scene that would remain etched in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. Detective Robert Kane, a 15-year veteran of Sacramento PD, arrived to find chaos controlled by yellow tape and flashing lights. The 45-year-old detective had seen his share of domestic violence, robbery gone wrong, and crimes of passion, but something about this scene felt different. Sarah Crawford had been stabbed multiple times, with a ferocity that spoke of rage, yet the apartment showed no signs of struggle beyond the living room. Her purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, her jewelry box remained closed, even the cash she kept in a coffee tin for emergencies was undisturbed. "This wasn't a robbery," Detective Kane muttered to his partner, Detective Maria Santos, as they surveyed the scene. "Someone came here specifically for her." The investigation began immediately, but in 1970, forensic science was limited to fingerprints, blood typing, and witness testimony. The biological evidence collected from the scene was minimal. A few drops of blood that didn't match Sarah's type, some fabric fibers, and what appeared to be skin cells under her fingernails. Evidence that would sit in manila folders for decades, waiting for science to catch up with justice. As news of Sarah's murder spread through Sacramento, the community reeled. This wasn't the rough part of town where violence was expected. This was Riverside Drive, where young professionals lived, where children rode bicycles on sidewalks, where neighbors knew each other's names. Sarah's death shattered that sense of safety like glass, leaving residents to double-check locks and peer suspiciously at shadows. The Sacramento Bee ran the headline on Sunday morning, "Court Reporter Murdered Days Before Wedding." The photograph they chose showed Sarah at a courthouse Christmas party, her arm around David, both of them laughing at something off camera. It was an image that would be reprinted dozens of times over the years, becoming the face of a mystery that would define a generation of Sacramento residents. David Mitchell was, naturally, the first person questioned. The grieving fiancé who had discovered the body, whose world had collapsed in a matter of minutes. But his alibi was airtight. He had been at his brother's house until late Friday night, helping prepare for a family barbecue planned for Sunday, a barbecue that was meant to be a pre-wedding celebration. Multiple family members confirmed his presence, and David's genuine grief was evident to even the most cynical detectives. "I was going to surprise her with breakfast," David told Detective Kane through tears during his interview. "She always worked late on Friday transcriptions to get ahead for Monday. I wanted to make sure she ate something before she got lost in her wedding planning." His voice broke as he described finding her, and even hardened detectives found themselves looking away from the raw pain in his eyes. As the investigation expanded, police interviewed Sarah's co-workers, neighbors, and friends. What emerged was a portrait of a woman who was universally loved but had no apparent enemies. Judge Patricia Williamson, for whom Sarah had worked for 3 years, described her as the most reliable, professional, and kind person in our courthouse. She treated everyone with respect, from senior judges to janitors. "I cannot imagine anyone wanting to harm her." But someone had wanted to harm her. Someone had entered her apartment on that October night with violence in their heart and murder on their mind. Someone who had walked the same streets, breathed the same air, and perhaps even smiled at her in passing, all while harboring darkness that would ultimately destroy her future. The wedding dress still hung in Sarah's bedroom closet when detectives processed the scene. A simple but elegant gown of ivory silk that would never dance at a reception, never pose for photographs, never fulfill its purpose. Detective Santos, who had daughters of her own, found herself staring at that dress longer than necessary, wondering about the dreams that died with Sarah Crawford. As October turned to November, and then to the harsh winter of 1970, the investigation began to slow. Leads that had seemed promising turned into dead ends. The mysterious blood drops led nowhere without DNA technology to analyze them. The fabric fibers were too common to trace. The skin cells under Sarah's fingernails could only tell investigators that she had fought her attacker, nothing more. By Christmas 1970, just 2 months after Sarah's murder, Detective Kane had to admit to himself what he couldn't yet say out loud. They were running out of options. The case that had started with such urgency, such certainty that justice would be swift, was beginning to show the signs of going cold. Phone calls to the tip line decreased. Witnesses had nothing new to add. Physical evidence had been processed and reprocessed with no new insights. But what Detective Kane didn't know, what no one in Sacramento could have known in 1970, was that the answer to Sarah Crawford's murder was walking among them. The killer was breathing the same air, shopping in the same stores, perhaps even reading the same newspaper articles about the investigation. They were hiding in plain sight, protected not by clever planning or criminal genius, but by the simple limitation of 1970s forensic technology. The truth was locked away in those few drops of blood, those skin cells, those fabric fibers that sat in evidence boxes like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom. Justice for Sarah Crawford would require patience, persistence, and most importantly, time for science to evolve to meet the demands of her case. As 1970 drew to a close, Sacramento began to heal from the shock of Sarah's murder, but the scar remained. Riverside Drive was never quite the same. The courthouse felt emptier without her precise transcriptions and warm smile, and David Mitchell, who would eventually move away from Sacramento because the memories were too painful, would carry the weight of that October morning for the rest of his life. Little did anyone know that they were at the beginning of a 52-year journey toward justice, a journey that would outlast careers, marriages, and even the life of the killer himself. The wedding dress that never walked would hang in the darkness of evidence storage, waiting for its own kind of resurrection through science and determination. In the winter of 1971, just 3 months after Sarah Crawford's brutal murder, Sacramento Police Detective Robert Kane sat in his cramped office, staring at a case file that had grown thick with dead ends. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across crime scene photographs that offered no new secrets. Outside, the city moved on with its daily rhythm, but inside that manila folder, time had stopped on October 5th. The investigation had consumed Kane's waking hours for months. He had interviewed over 100 people, from Sarah's childhood friends to courthouse janitors, from neighbors who claimed to have seen suspicious figures, to psychics who called with visions. Every lead had crumbled under scrutiny. Every hope had died in disappointment. The biological evidence sat in the property room like silent witnesses who refused to speak. "We're missing something," Kane told his partner, Detective Maria Santos, as she entered the office with 2 cups of coffee that had grown cold hours ago. "A woman doesn't get murdered 3 weeks before her wedding for no reason. There's a connection we're not seeing." Santos, a pragmatic woman who had learned to balance hope with reality, nodded grimly. "Maybe the connection died with her, Robert. Maybe the killer made sure of that." They didn't know it then, but their words were more prophetic than they realized. The connection they sought was indeed walking free, protected by an era when DNA was just beginning to be understood in laboratories, decades away from being used in criminal investigations. The killer they hunted breathed the same Sacramento air, perhaps even read the newspaper coverage of their investigation, safe in the knowledge that 1971 forensics could not touch them. As winter turned to spring, the daily urgency of Sarah's case began to compete with new crimes, new victims who demanded justice. Kane found himself pulled in multiple directions, but Sarah's file never left his desk. During quiet moments, he would open it and study the crime scene photos, searching for details that had been overlooked, clues that might reveal themselves under fresh scrutiny. The Crawford family had moved away by summer 1971. Sarah's parents, Thomas and Margaret Crawford, could no longer bear living in the same city where their daughter had been murdered without justice. Before leaving, Margaret made a pilgrimage to the courthouse where Sarah had worked, standing in the hallway where her daughter had walked thousands of times. "She loved this place," Margaret told Judge Patricia Williamson through tears. "She said the law was about truth, about making things right. I just wish it could make things right for her." Judge Williamson, a stern woman who rarely showed emotion in court, found herself crying alongside Margaret. "We won't forget her," she promised. "Sarah will always be part of this courthouse's memory." But memory, as both women would learn, is fragile. As 1971 became 1972 and 1975, Sarah Crawford's case joined the growing pile of unsolved murders that plagued American police departments. New detectives rotated through, inherited the file, studied it with fresh eyes, and eventually moved on to cases where progress seemed possible. David Mitchell, Sarah's fiancé, never fully recovered from that October morning. He eventually married another woman, had children, built a successful career as an architect, but those who knew him well noticed that he never quite smiled the same way again. On every October 15th, no matter where he was or what he was doing, David would grow quiet and distant, lost in memories of coffee and donuts and doors that opened to reveal nightmares. By 1980, a decade after the murder, Sacramento had changed dramatically. New neighborhoods sprawled across former farmland, the population doubled, and Riverside Drive was now part of a historic district popular with young professionals. The apartment where Sarah had died was renovated and rented to a series of tenants who knew nothing of its tragic history. Life moved forward, as it always does, leaving the dead to rest in filing cabinets and forgotten newspaper archives. Detective Kane retired in 1985, 15 years after taking Sarah's case. On his last day, he pulled her file from his desk drawer one final time. The photographs had faded slightly, the paper had yellowed, but the mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. He left detailed notes for whoever might inherit the case, along with a personal letter that would be found years later. "To whoever reads this, Sarah Crawford deserves justice. I failed to give it to her, but maybe you'll have tools I never had. Don't let her become just another cold case number. She was real. She mattered. Her dreams mattered. Find who took them away from her." The file passed to Detective Jennifer Walsh in 1986, a young investigator who had heard Kane's stories about the court reporter case. Walsh spent months reviewing everything, bringing 1980s technology to bear on 1970s evidence. She had the blood samples retested with more advanced techniques, but the results remained frustratingly incomplete. Blood type O positive, which described nearly half the adult male population. As the 1990s dawned, Sacramento's police department underwent modernization. Computer databases replaced handwritten logs, and old case files were digitized for easier storage and retrieval. Sarah's case received new life in electronic form, but the fundamental problem remained. The evidence was limited, the witnesses were aging or dead, and forensic science, while advancing rapidly, still couldn't extract meaningful DNA profiles from the degraded samples collected in 1993, 23 years after Sarah's murder, the Sacramento Bee ran a retrospective article titled "The Cold Cases That Haunt Us." Sarah's story occupied half a page, accompanied by the same Christmas party photograph that had become iconic. The article renewed public interest briefly, generating a handful of tips that led nowhere before fading back into the background noise of daily crime reporting. Meanwhile, somewhere in Sacramento, a killer continued living their life. Perhaps they had married, raised children, held steady employment, been a neighbor people trusted, a co-worker people respected. The capacity for violence that had exploded on that October night in 1970 had either been controlled or had found other outlets. They may have read the 1993 article and felt a moment of anxiety, but that anxiety would have passed when no new developments followed. Detective Walsh retired in 2001, passing Sarah's file to Detective Michael Torres, who brought new energy and fresh perspective to the case. Torres had grown up hearing about the Crawford murder from his father, who had been a young patrol officer in The case had haunted his family's dinner table conversations for years. "Every cop has that one case," Torres told his wife as he studied Sarah's file on their kitchen table. "The one that got away. For my dad, it was always this girl, this court reporter who was killed before her wedding. He used to say she haunted the entire department." Torres spent 2002 and 2003 conducting new interviews with the few surviving witnesses and family members. He tracked down David Mitchell, now living in Oregon with his second wife and teenage daughters. The conversation was painful but necessary. As 2005 approached, marking the 35th anniversary of Sarah's murder, Torres made a decision that would prove crucial decades later. He requested that all physical evidence from the case be transferred to a climate-controlled storage facility designed to preserve biological samples for potential future DNA analysis. The technology was improving rapidly, and Torres had heard about cases being solved using genetic material that had been considered useless just years earlier. "We may not be able to solve this case today," Torres wrote in his report, "but science is advancing faster than ever. What's impossible now may be routine in 10 or 20 years. We owe it to Sarah Crawford and her family to preserve every piece of evidence for future investigators who may have tools we can't even imagine." Torres didn't know how prophetic his words would prove to be. The evidence he carefully preserved in 2005 would indeed hold the key to solving Sarah's murder, but that key would remain hidden for another 17 years, waiting for genetic genealogy to emerge as the revolutionary tool that would finally give voice to those silent biological witnesses. As 2010 arrived 40 years after Sarah's death, Sacramento had become a different city entirely. The courthouse where she had worked had been renovated multiple times, its hallways walked by new generations of court reporters who had never heard her name. Riverside Drive had become a trendy neighborhood where young couples renovated old apartments and planted gardens in backyards where detectives had once searched for clues. But in the property room of the Sacramento Police Department, Sarah's evidence boxes remained untouched, waiting. The wedding dress had long since been returned to her family and donated to charity. But the more crucial items, the blood samples, the fabric fibers, skin cells that had lodged under her fingernails as she fought for her life, these remained preserved, patient, ready for their moment of revelation. Detective Torres retired in 2015, but not before ensuring that Sarah's case was flagged for review whenever new DNA technologies became available. His final notation in the case file was simple but profound. "Science will solve this. We just need to wait for it to catch up with our need for justice." By 2020, 50 years after Sarah Crawford's murder, the case had passed through 8 different detectives, survived 5 departmental reorganizations, and outlived many of the original investigators. But it had never been forgotten, never been relegated to dusty storage without hope of resolution. Each generation of detectives had added their own insights, their own determination, keeping the flame of investigation alive even when progress seemed impossible. And in 2020, as the world struggled with a global pandemic that changed everything about how people lived and worked, laboratories across the country were quietly perfecting techniques that would soon unlock the secrets held in decades-old evidence. Genetic genealogy was about to emerge from specialized research into mainstream criminal investigation, bringing with it the power to identify killers who had hidden behind the limitations of earlier forensic science. Sarah Crawford had waited 50 years for justice. She would only have to wait 2 more. In January 2022, Detective Lisa Chen sat in the Sacramento Police Department's newly renovated cold case unit, surrounded by monitors displaying genetic sequences that looked like abstract art to the untrained eye. At 38, Chen was part of a new generation of investigators who understood that solving murders was as much about science as it was about shoe leather. The Sarah Crawford file sat open on her desk, its yellowed pages a stark contrast to the cutting-edge technology humming around her. 52 years, Chen muttered to herself, studying the faded crime scene photographs. "You've been waiting 52 years, Sarah. Let's see if we can finally give you some answers." The world had changed dramatically since Detective Torres had preserved the evidence in 2005. Genetic genealogy, once the province of hobbyists tracing family trees, had exploded into criminal investigation following high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer. What had seemed like science fiction in 1970 was now routine, extracting DNA from degraded samples, building genetic profiles, and tracing family lines through public databases. Chen had inherited the Crawford case 6 months earlier, part of a department-wide initiative to apply new forensic techniques to old mysteries. She had already submitted the preserved blood samples and skin cells for advanced DNA extraction, a process that would have been impossible even 5 years earlier. Now she waited for results that could either break the case wide open or confirm that too much time had passed for even modern science to help. The call came on a grey Tuesday morning in February. Dr. Marcus Webb, from the California Department of Justice DNA Laboratory, had news that made Chen's heart race. "We got a profile," Webb said without preamble. "It's partial, but it's enough. Male subject, and the quality is good enough for genetic genealogy. I'm sending the files now." Chen's hands trembled slightly as she opened the encrypted files. After 52 years, Sarah Crawford's killer had left his calling card in those drops of blood, those skin cells scraped in desperate self-defense. The genetic profile stared back at her from the screen, a unique combination of markers that belonged to one person who had walked into that Riverside Drive apartment in October 1970, with murder in his heart. The next step was both simple and complex. Upload the profile to GED Match, a public genetic genealogy database where millions of people had shared their DNA results for family research. If the killer had relatives who had tested their DNA for ancestry purposes, the system would find them. It was like casting a net into an ocean of genetic information, hoping to catch connections that would lead back to one specific person. Chen worked with Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. Their analyst, Jennifer Morrison, had solved dozens of cold cases using family tree analysis. Together they watched as the system began generating matches, distant cousins, second cousins twice removed, genetic breadcrumbs that would hopefully lead to a name. "We've got several matches in the 20-50 centimorgan range," Morrison reported during a video call 3 days later. "That suggests second to third cousins. I'm building family trees now, looking for common ancestors." The process was painstaking. Morrison constructed elaborate family trees going back generations, tracing marriages, births and deaths through public records. She was looking for convergence points, places where different family lines met that could point to their suspect. It was genealogy as detective work, using DNA as the ultimate witness. Meanwhile, Chen dove back into the original case file with fresh eyes. Who in Sarah's orbit in 1970 might have had access to her apartment? Who might have known her routines? The original investigators had been thorough, but they were looking for obvious connections. Chen was looking for shadows, for people who might have been peripheral to Sarah's life, but central to her death. 2 weeks into the genetic genealogy analysis, Morrison called with excitement in her voice. "I've found a cluster, 3 family trees that converge on a couple who lived in Sacramento in the 1940s, Robert and Helen Davis. They had 4 sons. Based on the DNA matches and geographical analysis, your suspect is likely one of their sons or grandsons." Chen felt the familiar tingle of a case beginning to crack open. She pulled public records on the Davis family, building her own timeline. Robert and Helen Davis had indeed lived in Sacramento, raising 4 sons, William, James, Richard, and Thomas. All 4 had remained in the Sacramento area, into adulthood. All 4 would have been the right age, but it was the 3rd son, Richard John Davis, who made Chen's investigative instincts flare. Born in 1945, he would have been 25 in 1970. Employment records showed he had worked as a maintenance man for several apartment complexes in Sacramento during the late 1960s and early 1970s, including, Chen discovered with growing excitement, the complex where Sarah Crawford had lived. "Got you," Chen whispered to the photograph of Richard Davis she had found in a 1969 employee newsletter. The black and white image showed a young man with unremarkable features, medium height, brown hair, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd. the kind of face that could smile at residents while harboring dark fantasies. But there was a problem. Richard John Davis had died in 1997 from complications related to chronic alcoholism. He had been 52 years old, living in a rundown apartment in West Sacramento, dying alone and unmourned. If he was indeed Sarah's killer, he had taken his secrets to an unmarked grave in the Sacramento City Cemetery. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing old employment records, Chen found that Davis had been fired from the apartment complex in November 1970, just weeks after Sarah's murder. The reason listed was inappropriate behavior toward female residents and failure to maintain professional boundaries. The manager who had fired him was long dead, but Chen tracked down his daughter, now in her 70s. "My father came home very upset one day," Martha Henley recalled over the phone. "He said he'd had to fire the maintenance man because female residents were complaining. They said he would enter their apartments for repairs that hadn't been requested, that he made them uncomfortable. Dad felt terrible because the man seemed so normal, so helpful most of the time." Chen's investigation revealed more disturbing patterns. Davis had been arrested twice in the 1970s for voyeurism, though the charges had been dropped both times. In 1983, he had been questioned in connection with an attempted assault on a woman in her apartment, but lack of evidence had prevented charges. The woman's description of her attacker matched Davis, and she had reported that he seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen him. To confirm the DNA match, Chen needed a direct sample from Davis, or a close relative. Davis had never married and had no children, but she discovered he had a younger brother, Thomas, still living in a nursing home in Folsom. California law allowed for the collection of DNA from relatives in cold case investigations, and Thomas Davis, informed of the situation, agreed to provide a sample. Richard was always troubled, Thomas told Chen during their meeting. His 78-year-old hands shook as he held a cup of coffee. Even as kids, there was something off about him. He would watch people, especially women, in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Our parents tried to help him, but he just got worse as he got older. When he died, I hate to say it, but I felt relieved. Is that terrible? Chen assured him it wasn't terrible at all. Family members of criminals often carried their own burden of guilt and confusion, wondering if they could have done something different, if they should have seen the signs more clearly. The DNA comparison between Thomas Davis and the crime scene evidence confirmed what the genetic genealogy had suggested. Richard John Davis was indeed the source of the blood and skin cells found at Sarah Crawford's murder scene. The match was definitive, a 1 in 700 trillion probability that it could be anyone else. As Chen assembled her final report, she thought about the strange journey this case had taken. Richard Davis had lived for 27 years after murdering Sarah Crawford. He had walked free while her family grieved, while David Mitchell rebuilt his life around a wound that would never fully heal, while generations of detectives passed the unsolvable case between them like a cursed heirloom. Davis's life after 1970 painted a picture of gradual dissolution. Unable to hold steady employment after being fired from the apartment complex, he had drifted through temporary jobs and increasing alcoholism. Former neighbors in his final apartment building described him as a recluse who rarely spoke to anyone, who would sit on his balcony drinking cheap whiskey and staring at nothing. He was like a ghost, one former neighbor recalled, present but not really there. Sometimes you'd hear him talking to himself, arguing with someone who wasn't there. We all just stayed away from him. Chen wondered if Sarah Crawford had haunted Richard Davis in those final years. Did he think about her when he drank himself into oblivion? Did her face appear in his nightmares? Or had he managed to compartmentalize his crime, filing it away like old paperwork in the cluttered apartment where he died alone? The motive, when it finally emerged, was as banal as it was horrifying. Through interviews with former residents and careful reconstruction of events, Chen determined that Davis had likely been stalking Sarah for weeks before the murder. As the maintenance man, he had keys to all apartments and knew when residents would be home. He had probably entered her apartment multiple times when she was at work, familiarizing himself with her space, her belongings, her life. On the night of October 15, 1970, Davis had entered Sarah's apartment with a master key, probably intending assault, but Sarah had fought back. The defensive wounds and DNA evidence proved that, in the struggle, Davis had grabbed a knife from her kitchen and stabbed her repeatedly. What might have started as a sexual assault had escalated to murder when Sarah refused to be a victim. The final piece of the puzzle came from Sarah's case files at the courthouse. Chen discovered that 3 weeks before her murder, Sarah had transcribed testimony in a case involving a landlord accused of entering female tenants' apartments without permission. The testimony was graphic and detailed, describing the fear and violation the women felt. Chen couldn't prove it, but she suspected Davis might have known about this case, might have felt threatened by Sarah's role in documenting such crimes. As Chen prepared to announce the case's resolution, she thought about all the people who had been touched by this tragedy. David Mitchell, now 74 and living in Oregon, would finally have answers. The Crawford family, what remained of them, would know who had stolen Sarah's future. The generations of detectives who had carried this case in their hearts would see their dedication vindicated. But Richard John Davis would never face justice in a courtroom. He had escaped into death, leaving behind only DNA and a trail of damaged lives. It was a resolution without satisfaction, answers without accountability, justice delayed so long that it had been ultimately denied. On a crisp March morning in 2022, Detective Lisa Chen stood before a packed press conference room at the Sacramento Police Department. Cameras clicked and flashed as she approached the podium, carrying the weight of 52 years of waiting. Behind her, enlarged photographs showed two faces: Sarah Crawford, forever young and smiling, and Richard John Davis, the maintenance man, whose ordinary appearance had masked extraordinary evil. Today, we announce that the 1970 murder of Sarah Elizabeth Crawford has been solved through advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, Chen began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The killer was Richard John Davis, a maintenance worker at her apartment complex who died in 1997. While Davis will never face earthly justice, we hope this resolution brings some measure of peace to those who loved Sarah and never forgot her. In Oregon, David Mitchell sat in his living room, watching the press conference on his laptop. His wife held his hand as tears rolled down his weathered face. At 74, he had lived more years without Sarah than with her, but this moment collapsed time. He was 22 again, standing outside her apartment with coffee and donuts, about to discover that the world could shatter in an instant. 52 years, he whispered to his wife. I've waited 52 years to know why. The why, as Chen explained to the media, was as simple as it was horrifying. Richard Davis had been a predator hiding in plain sight, using his position to access vulnerable women. Sarah had simply been the one who fought back too hard, who refused to be a victim, who paid for her courage with her life. The press conference unleashed a flood of memories across Sacramento. People who had lived through the original investigation called into radio shows, sharing their recollections of the fear that had gripped Riverside Drive. Former courthouse employees remembered Sarah's dedication and warmth. The story that had been Sacramento's wound for 5 decades was finally being allowed to heal. But the revelation also opened new wounds. Chen's investigation had uncovered Davis's pattern of predatory behavior, and other women began coming forward with their own stories. Women who had been young apartment residents in the early 1970s, who had complained about the creepy maintenance man who entered their homes too often, who stood too close, who made excuses to be in their bedrooms. I knew it was him the moment I saw his picture, said Patricia Vance, now 73, who had lived in the same complex as Sarah. He came into my apartment once when I was in the shower, said he was checking the water heater. I screamed and he left, but I never felt safe there again. I moved out a month later. When I heard about Sarah, I always wondered, but the police said they'd investigated everyone. The original investigators had interviewed Davis in 1970, but only as part of a routine canvass of apartment employees. His alibi that he had been at a bar that night had been corroborated by drinking buddies who were probably too intoxicated to remember clearly. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, he had slipped through the investigative net. Chen spent weeks tracking down more of Davis's history, building a fuller picture of the man who had escaped justice for 27 years. What emerged was a portrait of escalating dysfunction. After his firing from the apartment complex, Davis had bounced between menial jobs, leaving each one under clouds of suspicion. Former employers reported missing items from female employees' desks, complaints about inappropriate comments, a pattern of behavior that never quite rose to the level of arrest. He was like a shadow, recalled James Morrison, who had employed Davis as a janitor in 1978. Always there when you didn't expect him, especially around the women's areas. We let him go after 6 months. Couldn't prove anything, but everyone was uncomfortable. The genetic genealogy that had solved the case became a topic of national discussion. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of public DNA databases for criminal investigations, while victims' rights groups hailed it as a revolutionary tool for justice. Chen found herself at the center of debates about technology, privacy, and the rights of the living versus justice for the dead. But for Chen, the case remained deeply personal. She had spent months living with Sarah Crawford's ghost, studying her photographs, reading her court transcriptions, trying to understand the woman whose death she was investigating. In solving the case, she had also come to know Richard Davis more intimately than she had ever wanted to know another human being's darkness. The apartment building where Sarah had died still stood on Riverside Drive, now converted to condominiums. Chen visited it one evening, standing in the parking lot where Davis had probably stood, watching Sarah's windows, planning his crime. The current residents knew nothing of the building's tragic history, going about their lives in spaces where horror had once lived. Inside apartment 2B, where Sarah had died, a young couple was cooking dinner. Chen could see them through the window, laughing at something on TV, unaware that they were standing where a woman had fought for her life and lost. It was a strange comfort, seeing life continue where death had once seemed so final. As the media attention began to fade, Chen turned her focus to the deeper implications of the case. Richard Davis hadn't been a criminal mastermind or a calculated killer. He had been an inadequate man with violent fantasies who had acted on them one October night. His ordinariness was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the case, how someone so unremarkable could cause such devastating harm. The Sacramento Police Department used the Crawford case to review other cold cases from the same era, looking for potential connections to Davis. While no definitive links were found, several unsolved assaults from the early 1970s showed similar patterns. Women attacked in their apartments, no forced entry, no theft. Cases that had been attributed to different perpetrators might have been the work of one man, testing boundaries that would eventually lead to murder. Thomas Davis, Richard's surviving brother, struggled with the revelation. He had provided the DNA that confirmed his brother's guilt, but the knowledge weighed on him. Chen met with him several times, trying to provide context and closure. "I keep thinking about that girl's family," Thomas said during one meeting. "My brother took their daughter. How do you live with that? How do I live with knowing I share blood with someone who could do that?" Chen had no easy answers. The ripple effects of violent crime spread far beyond the immediate victims, touching families and communities in ways that could never be fully measured or healed. Thomas Davis would carry his brother's crime for the rest of his life, an unwilling inheritor of a legacy of violence. The case files, which had passed through so many hands over 5 decades, were finally marked closed in the system. But Chen kept copies of everything, knowing that closed didn't mean forgotten. Sarah Crawford's story had become part of Sacramento's history, a reminder of how long justice could take and how technology could resurrect voices from the past. In the end, it was the wedding dress that haunted Chen most. That symbol of a future that never came to pass, of dreams interrupted by violence. She had seen a photograph of it in the old evidence files. Ivory silk, simple but elegant, waiting for a day that would never come. It had been donated to charity by Sarah's family in the 1970s, probably worn by another bride who never knew its history. Somewhere, Chen thought, a woman had walked down an aisle in Sarah Crawford's dress, had danced at her reception, had lived the life Sarah should have had. It was a strange kind of justice, perhaps, life continuing despite death's interruption, joy persisting despite tragedy's attempt to end it. As spring turned to summer in 2022, the Crawford case began to fade from public memory, replaced by new crimes, new mysteries. But for those who had been touched by it, the investigators who had carried it through decades, the families who had lived with unanswered questions, the community that had been scarred by it, the resolution brought a complex mix of relief and sorrow. Justice delayed for 52 years was indeed justice denied. In many ways, Richard Davis had lived and died without accountability. Sarah's parents had gone to their graves without answers. David Mitchell had built an entire life around a wound that could never fully heal. But the truth, finally revealed, had its own power. It said that Sarah Crawford mattered, that her death would not be forgotten, that science and dedication could speak for the dead, even across half a century. In the Sacramento County Courthouse where Sarah had worked, a small plaque was installed in her memory. It read simply, "In memory of Sarah Elizabeth Crawford, 1942-1970. Court reporter, colleague, friend. Justice delayed, but not forgotten." Every day, new court reporters passed by it, most not knowing the full story, but carrying forward the work Sarah had loved. And in the files of the Sacramento Police Department, Sarah Crawford's case served as a reminder and a promise that no case was ever truly cold, that science would continue to advance, that the dead would eventually have their day in court, even if their killers had escaped into death themselves. The wedding dress that never walked had finally found its own kind of aisle, not in a church but in a courtroom of public opinion, where truth was revealed and justice, however delayed, was finally served. 6 months after the press conference that closed Sarah Crawford's case, Sacramento had moved on to new headlines and fresh tragedies. But in a modest ranch house in Folsom, Thomas Davis sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a box of photographs he hadn't opened in 20 years. His brother, Richard's face stared back at him from faded Polaroids, family barbecues, Christmas mornings, ordinary moments that now seemed tainted by the knowledge of what Richard had been capable of. Detective Lisa Chen had stayed in touch with Thomas, checking in periodically. She understood that solving a cold case created new victims, family members who had to reconcile their memories with monstrous truths. Thomas had become one of those secondary casualties, carrying a burden he never asked for. "I keep looking for signs," Thomas told Chen during one of their phone calls. "In these old pictures, in my memories, was there something we missed? Something we should have seen? But he just looks normal. That's what terrifies me most." The normalcy of evil was something Chen had grappled with throughout her career, but the Crawford case had crystallized it in ways that haunted her. Richard Davis hadn't been a dramatic villain. He'd been a below-average man with above-average darkness, hidden behind an unremarkable face and a maintenance uniform. In Oregon, David Mitchell had experienced his own complex aftermath. The resolution he'd waited 52 years for had brought not peace, but a different kind of turmoil. His daughters, now adults themselves, watched their father process grief that predated their existence. "He's been crying a lot," David's eldest daughter, Jennifer, confided to her mother. "Not sad tears exactly, more like relief, like he's been holding his breath for 50 years and can finally exhale." David had started writing letters to Sarah, not mailing them, of course, but writing them longhand in a journal his therapist had suggested. Letters telling her about the life he'd lived, the daughters he'd raised, the career he'd built, apologizing for moving on, thanking her for the time they'd had, wrestling with survivor's guilt that had calcified over decades. "Dear Sarah," one letter began, "they found him, the man who took you from us. He's been dead for 25 years. I don't know how to feel about that. Part of me wishes he was alive to face what he did. Part of me is glad he's gone. Most of me just feels empty. I thought knowing would fill the hole you left, but it just changed its shape. The ripple effects of the case's resolution spread in unexpected ways. The apartment complex where Sarah had died became an unofficial landmark for true crime enthusiasts, much to the dismay of current residents. Tour groups would occasionally stop outside, guides recounting the story of the court reporter and the maintenance man, turning tragedy into entertainment. Chen found herself fielding requests from podcast producers, documentary filmmakers, and authors wanting to tell Sarah's story. She turned them all down initially, feeling protective of a woman she'd never met, but had come to know intimately through investigation. But eventually she agreed to consult on a documentary that promised to focus on the advances in forensic science rather than sensationalizing the crime. This isn't just about one case, Chen explained to the filmmakers. It's about how science is giving voices back to victims who were silenced before we had the tools to hear them. Sarah Crawford waited 52 years for justice. There are thousands more still waiting. The documentary, titled The DNA of Justice, featured interviews with the surviving detectives who had worked Sarah's case over the decades. Detective Robert Kane, now 92 and living in a retirement community, spoke with tears in his eyes about the case that had defined his career. "I promised her justice," Kane said, his voice still strong despite his age. "I couldn't keep that promise with what we had in 1970. But I knew someday, somehow, someone would. Science caught up with our need for answers. I just wish it had happened sooner." Detective Maria Santos had passed away in 2010, but her daughter shared memories of how the Crawford case had affected her mother. She kept Sarah's picture in her desk drawer for 30 years. Santos's daughter revealed. Every new case she worked, she'd look at that picture and promise to do better, to be more thorough. Sarah became her standard for dedication. The documentary also explored the darker questions raised by the case. How many Richard Davises were out there? How many predators had escaped justice simply because they committed their crimes before DNA evidence became standard? How many families were still waiting for answers that might never come? Dr. Marcus Webb, the DNA analyst who had extracted Richard Davis's profile from the degraded evidence, became something of a celebrity in forensic science circles. He used the Crawford case as a teaching example, showing how persistence and advancing technology could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. "Every year our extraction techniques get better," Webb explained to a conference of forensic scientists. "Evidence that was useless 5 years ago might yield results today. That's why preservation is so crucial. Those evidence boxes aren't just holding fabric and biological samples, they're holding future justice." The California Department of Justice launched a new initiative based partly on the Crawford case's success, systematically reviewing cold cases with preserved biological evidence. Within a year, 3 more cases from the 1970s were solved using genetic genealogy, each bringing closure to families who had given up hope. But not all the effects were positive. The use of public DNA databases for criminal investigation sparked fierce debates about privacy and consent. People who had submitted their DNA for ancestry research found themselves unwittingly part of criminal investigations. Some databases changed their policies, requiring users to opt in for law enforcement searches. Thomas Davis found himself caught in these debates. He had voluntarily provided his DNA to confirm his brother's guilt, but the experience left him conflicted. "I'm glad I could help bring closure to that poor girl's family," Thomas said. "But it's strange knowing my genetic information is now part of this whole system. What else might it be used for? Where does it end?" Chen understood his concerns but remained convinced that the technology was worth the ethical complications. She had seen too many families destroyed by unsolved murders, too many killers walking free because traditional investigation had failed. Genetic genealogy wasn't perfect, but it was a tool for justice that previous generations could only dream of. As 2023 arrived, Chen found herself promoted to head of the cold case unit, partly due to her success with the Crawford case. She inherited dozens of unsolved murders, each with its own Sarah Crawford waiting for answers. She approached each case with the same dedication, knowing that behind every file was a family frozen in grief, a community wounded by violence, a story incomplete. The Crawford case had taught her patience. Justice didn't operate on human timescales. It could take decades, outlive the killers themselves, require technologies not yet invented, but it would come, eventually, for those who refused to give up. In Sacramento, life continued its relentless forward motion. The courthouse, where Sarah had worked, bustled with new cases, new court reporters capturing testimony that might matter decades in the future. But reminders persisted for those who knew where to look. The plaque in the courthouse, the occasional flower left at Sarah's grave by someone who remembered, the detectives who carried forward lessons learned from 5 decades of investigation, the families who finally had answers, even if they came too late for true justice. Richard Davis's grave in Sacramento City Cemetery remained unmarked as it had since 1997. Thomas had considered placing a stone there, wrestling with family obligation versus the horror of his brother's crime. In the end, he decided to let Richard remain anonymous in death as he had tried to be in life after the murder. Some people don't deserve to be remembered, Thomas concluded. Let him be forgotten. Let Sarah be the one people remember. And she was remembered in ways both formal and informal. Law enforcement training programs used her case to teach about evidence preservation. Forensic science conferences featured presentations on the DNA extraction techniques that had solved her murder. True crime enthusiasts debated the details online, keeping her story alive in digital spaces. But perhaps the most meaningful remembrance came from an unexpected source. In 2023, the Sacramento County Superior Court established the Sarah Crawford Memorial Scholarship for aspiring court reporters. Funded partly by donations from the documentary and partly by the Court Reporters Association, it would help young women enter the profession Sarah had loved. At the scholarship's first award ceremony, David Mitchell made the journey from Oregon to present the award. At 75, he moved slowly but spoke with clarity about the woman he had planned to marry 53 years earlier. Sarah believed in justice, David told the assembled crowd. She believed in the power of words to capture truth, to preserve it for future examination. She would be amazed to know that science we couldn't imagine in 1970 would eventually speak for her, but she wouldn't be surprised that people never gave up on finding her killer. That's the kind of person she was. Impossible to forget. The first recipient of the scholarship was a young woman named Maria Gonzalez, who had grown up in the same neighborhood where Sarah had died. She had learned about the case in high school and been inspired to pursue court reporting, drawn by the idea of preserving truth for future justice. I never met Sarah Crawford, Maria said in her acceptance speech, but her story taught me that every word we record matters. Every piece of evidence we preserve could be the key to justice, even if it takes 50 years to turn in the lock. As Chen watched the ceremony from the back of the room, she reflected on the strange journey of the Crawford case. From brutal murder to cold case to forensic breakthrough to memorial scholarship, it was a path no one could have predicted. Justice had taken forms beyond criminal prosecution, creating positive ripples from an act of terrible violence. The wedding dress that never walked had become something else entirely, a symbol of persistence, of science serving justice, of communities refusing to forget their wounded. Sarah Crawford had been denied her future, but her story had helped secure justice for others, had inspired new court reporters, had pushed forensic science forward. It wasn't the legacy she had planned, but it was a legacy nonetheless. And in the end, that's all any of us can hope for. That our stories, even our tragedies, might serve some greater purpose, might light the way for those who come after us, might ensure that justice, however delayed, eventually finds its voice.